Serious, Redditors who work around death, what are some last words or moments that have stuck with you? I don't want help, I just wanted you to know where they can find my body. First suicidal person I spoke to who actually did it. I sometimes wonder what's worse, that you are going to die, but you don't want to, or that you want to die because life is too difficult to bear and willfully do it. Was a nurse taking care of a young 20-something kid who was in multi-organ failure due to a H overdose. I remember being floored at how well his mom was taking it. After she opted to pull the plug, I told her she could stay with him for a minute. She declined. I didn't really say anything, but she said he's been dead for years now. I started saving for his funeral a year ago. I came to terms with this long before it happened. I was pretty shaken up, so I said something about her grace in the morning. She said that she will always remember him as a little boy who loved his dog and whose legs she had to hide at night so he would actually sleep. I had spent years cultivating an attitude of separation from my patients, but it all came tumbling down with this one mother. I walked out of the hospital that day and never came back. I work in finance now. I've been sober off H for about a month and a half now and was having a really hard time tonight. But this made me think about my parents and them having to go through this, and it helped me a lot. My parents are the only people that have stuck by me through this whole thing, and they deserve so much better. I work at a business that designs and manufactures coffins, so not directly around death, but pretty dang close. Oftentimes we receive special requests from the deceased's family to engrave messages or even images on the coffin. The most common by far is the birth date and death date, the dead person's name, and we even get requests to engrave their face onto the coffin. But about 5 years ago I got a call from someone who had recently ordered a generic wooden coffin. Doesn't matter how many of these calls I've had to take over the years. It's depressing every single time I have to listen to someone talk about their dead loved one. This woman was almost in tears from the second I picked up the phone, and I was certainly in tears by the end of the call. She told me the story of her father who had flew Boeing planes throughout the Vietnam War and had gone on to be a commercial pilot for Pan Am. Flying airplanes was his entire life. Finally, she told me about how her father had been hit with a sudden heart attack at the age of 74 after being healthy as a horse his entire life. While lying on a hospital bed almost waiting to die, he looked out the window to his right and whispered what turned out to be his last words. "Looks like a beautiful night to fly." The woman asked me to engrave those words on his coffin. I cried for a while after that one. Those are some beautiful last words. Two people stick out in my mind. At the time I was 18 and working in an end-of-life nursing home. All of our patients were DNR. It was a pretty depressing place and the facility was not that nice. The first was a woman named Helen. She was in her 90s and very frail. Her body just started shutting down and we knew she didn't have long. She was put on hospice and we made sure she was as comfortable as possible. Every time she took a breath there was this horrible rattle. She had hours left and somehow she hung on for days. She wanted to see her daughter one last time and so she clung to life. Every person I have watched die has the same look in their eyes. Kind of this restless and trapped look. But there was panic in her eyes as well. Like she knew there wasn't enough time. Her daughter never came to see her and I will never forget the sound of her fighting to breathe and the look in her eyes. The second person I will never forget is David. He and his wife were the only married couple in our facility, but they had different rooms because the nursing home had this policy that men and women couldn't share a room. Apparently it didn't matter that they were married. David had had a stroke and was partially paralyzed and had trouble eating and speaking as a result, but otherwise was pretty healthy. His wife was mobile and healthy, sound mind. She was also a total B towards staff, but she just wanted to make sure her husband had everything he needed and the best care. She was his voice. One day she had a massive stroke. She survived and came back to our facility, but she was basically a vegetable, completely unresponsive and unaware. A few weeks later I took David to her room for his nightly visit. He sat in his wheelchair looking at his wife and she stared at the ceiling. When I took him to his room to get ready for bed he looked at me and said something, but I had trouble hearing and understanding him, so I leaned in close and asked him to repeat himself. He said, "I want to die. I don't want to live anymore." I was completely speechless. Of course I understood why he wanted to die. His quality of life was crap. His kids never came to visit. and the one person who was always there for him didn't even notice his existence anymore. What could I possibly say to him? Honestly, I don't even remember how I responded. I changed his clothes and his depends, and got him into bed. He didn't get out of bed after that and went downhill pretty fast. Less than a week after telling me he wanted to die, he was dead and his wife never noticed the difference. Moral of the story: the will to live or the lack of will to live is very real and very powerful. Whoa, these are both heartbreaking. But Helen really got me. The amount of pain she went through to see her daughter one more time and never got to. Former EMT. We ran this one kid from a major hospital to a cancer treatment center down the road. He was 21 years old, and aside from being skinny, you wouldn't ever think he was ill. We mostly dealt with lethargic elderly people, so it was kind of a breath of fresh air that day to work with this kid. He didn't really require any care during transport, so we laughed and joked a lot. Dude was hyper as a hummingbird on Red Bull. He told us how he got brain cancer at 17 and kicked its butt. It had gone into remission for about 3 years, then came back. I remember him saying how this was no big deal and he was going to win round 2 just as easily as round 1. We clapped hands and did the manly bro hug on the way out. You know where you clap them on the back a few times. I left feeling really good. We came back the next day to run him for his next treatment. They had forgotten to cancel the call. He had died about 30 minutes after we dropped him back off. I had to sit down after that one. He was so full of life, and then, just, gone. My dad was fighting cancer this year and he looked like heck. I was visiting from across the country and they said when I arrived it was like a breath of life just picked him up out of his illness. I was also told that boosts of energy were a sign that death was near. He began to decline rapidly after I left and died on my birthday just a few months ago. I worked in emergency services for 10 years, so here is my craziest. One guy was dying of cancer and kept saying that he needed to go. I gotta go, and trying to pull himself out of bed. Finally, he stopped struggling and looked straight ahead at nothing, and said his late wife's name, then passed away. I know people don't believe in afterlife heaven here, but I really hope I get eternity with my wife. I'm terrified of losing her. It feels like it would be a piece of my soul being torn away. IQ Tech held the hand of a 94-year-old right before she died. Last thing she said that I could make out: make sure my son takes care of my dog. Nurse, 31-year-old anorexia patient who weighed 29 kilograms. The last words from her were, "I've left this too late, haven't I?" after being told her liver was dead. For Americans like me, 29 kilograms is roughly 64 pounds. Holy crap. I have cared for many elderly residents passing away, but my favorite story was a sweet lady we'll call V. She was very weak and just beginning the process of actively dying. We were trying to pull her nightgown up to make sure she was dry, but she started fighting us tooth and nail to keep her gown down, while she stared into space. She had never given any of us a lick of trouble in that department, and she had no modesty issues with the staff. We waited a couple of minutes and tried again, but she kept looking at the ceiling and batting us away with her hands. She was stone deaf, so there was no point in explaining ourselves. Finally, on our third attempt, V motioned with her hand and shouted, "Not in front of the angels." We backed off for a while after that. She passed away that night. AWW. I used to work in a funeral home that also owned a busy crematory. We had shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of unclaimed ashes. Dozens if not hundreds of boxes spread across our multiple locations. All those people lived their lives and died without anyone to care enough to take a pound of ashes home and find somewhere nice to put them. I can't stand listening to people say everything works out, everyone finds someone, etc. I wish I'd taken pictures of the boxes so I could show them that no, a whole lot of people die absolutely alone and no one ever cares. I think a lot of people want to be forgotten. I wouldn't mind really. As a medical surgical nurse, I had a patient who was a long-time alcoholic and was actively dying. The patient didn't say anything because he was pumped full of pain meds and essentially unconscious as he slowly died, but I will never forget his wife and teenage son's faces as they suffered through this man's death. Thanks to the alcoholism, the patient was incredibly jaundiced, which made his skin and the whites of his eyes this awful yellow color that just screamed sickness and death. His liver had shut down and his blood was losing the ability to clot, and somewhere in his esophagus or stomach he had begun to bleed. As his alcohol-damaged arteries gave out, so as he breathed out blood would bubble up over his dry yellow lips. His breath stank and the whole room smelled like old blood. His wife and son sat there at the side of his bed for hours, his wife gently suctioning away the blood from his mouth with a little suction tubing, and just silently crying. His teenage son asked me, is he getting morphine? Can he feel anything? And I reassured him that his father wasn't in any pain, and the son kind of laughed without looking away from his father's face and said, at least he's getting the good stuff, right? Finally the patient died, and his wife was able to stop suctioning blood out of his mouth, and eventually they were able to go home. But I don't know if they'll ever be able to forget that image or that smell. I'm 60 days sober tomorrow. Jesus, that was tough to read right there. I work as a social worker for a few police departments. They use me for crisis calls like homicides and suicides to stay with the families and talk them through stuff. There was a kid a few years ago who killed himself by jumping off a parking garage. He was maybe 14 or 15, gay, and sick of feeling like he didn't fit in. The really fricked up part was that the dad found him right as he was about to jump. The kid turned around, saw his dad, and then turned back around and jumped. The thing that stuck with me was that the parents had a huge sense of relief for the entire time I was with them. I stayed with them in their house through the night. They kept saying things like, well, it's over. Their reactions have just stuck with me. They were sad, but they were more relieved than sad. That's the way my brother's death felt. The guy finally found his way out. I had a patient with cirrhosis related to fatty liver. I counseled him heavily prior to this to lose weight. He didn't heed my advice. He developed diabetes and then developed a terrible non-healing ulcer on his leg, then the other. Both soon spread to gangrene and he was admitted to hospital for bilateral leg amputations. He only said one thing to me after he woke up after the operation. Doctor, good news. I've lost a bit of weight. He died a few hours later. I miss him very much. I've had NASH for a decade now and have finally started losing significant amounts of weight. My numbers have gone down a lot to the point I don't qualify for a lot of the studies. Your story makes me want to lose it even more. Ty for sharing. I work in a hospital, and part of my training was taking care of the morgue. Every day you have to go through the list of bodies, make sure they're all still where they're supposed to be. This is because if a body goes missing by being released to the wrong people, i.e., is transported to the wrong funeral home, it's a bad thing, and the hospital could get in big legal trouble. I was down there every morning for a week. You check through the list with the names and the ages and how long the morgue has had them. The thing that really stuck with me was a lady who had died at age 96, who had been in our morgue for a month, and was still there when I finished my week. Nobody came to claim her body. I don't know who she was, but I still think of her sometimes because in the end, she had nobody left. I imagine she had no children, and had outlived all her friends. I don't think anybody deserves to be forgotten like that, so I don't think I can forget her. Well, now you don't have to take that burden yourself. We can share. Cop here. There aren't a lot of super dramatic movie-like death scenes in real life. Most last words are something like frick or crap. I've literally had to shout at people to tell me who stabbed them. Sometimes it pays off. I'm not sure if this post is specifically referring to human death, but I work at an animal clinic. We obviously have to deal with euthanasias, aborting animals, sick animals dying in the hospital area, etc. The worst is when you're in a room with a client and their animal is about to be euthanized. A lot of clients are elderly. They will tell stories and say things like she is all I had left, with tears streaming down their face, and it takes everything in me not to cry. Not sure if this response counts, but yeah. I worked as a food delivery person in a hospital when I was younger. I mainly worked on the floor that was like a nursing home for older patients. I took a tray into a room once and asked the woman if I should leave it on her tray or if she was going to get up and go to her table. She told me not to bother because she wouldn't be needing food anymore. I was required to leave it, so I just said okay and left it on her table. I went back an hour later to pick up trays and her room was empty. She had passed away. I'll never forget that. Former care assistant here. I've seen residents come and go, one or two, fortunately, to more suitable residential or rehabilitation units, most sadly but gracefully to their end. One gentleman who sticks out in my mind had been transferred from our residential unit to our secure wing dementia unit due to deteriorating health mentally and physically. In the space of roughly 8 weeks he went from singing joyfully and watching Countdown to see Rachel Riley, the cheeky bugger, to being unable to perform the simplest task without our assistance. I'm not going to provide the exact details here because even a year on it's still raw, but the last time I saw him alive was the end of my evening shift. In his bed, crying and cold despite the blankets and new pajamas we bought him, soaked through with urine and hopelessly confused. Our night shift team, by all accounts, did a wonderful job trying to make him comfortable and more human that night. He passed away in the middle of my morning shift the next day, as we were doing early rounds. Rest in peace, Mac. By God, you knew how to make us smile. Thank you for caring for him. I'm a nurse doing rounds and found a patient had climbed out of bed, vomited blood, somehow wedged in between the head of the bed and the wall, kneeling, dead. There was blood everywhere, and rosary beads in their hand. Last seen 20 minutes prior to my finding them. It was a horrible scene I can still see clearly 10 years later. Woman with known history of significant postpartum hemorrhages, still insists on having home birth. Woman bleeds heaps, rushed to hospital but too far gone already and dies. My colleague was working night shift and ran to deliver blood to ICU. Usually we wait for a porter to pick it up. She said the husband was on his knees crying and screaming at the doctors to do something. Such a pointless freaking waste of life. This woman would probably still be alive if she didn't insist on having a home birth. I feel bad for her kids growing up without a mum. I feel horrible for the husband. I'm a paramedic. We had a call one day and the PT couldn't describe what was wrong. We asked him, well, how do you feel? He responded with, I feel like I'm about to die, without the drama that's normally associated with that phrase. It had an eerie finality to it that made us all a little unnerved. By the time we got him into the ambulance, he had gone into cardiac arrest. Paramedic here too, and have had patients say the same thing. I've learned that when a patient tells you that they feel that they are going to die, without all the usual drama as you mention, they usually aren't messing around. Such an odd profession we're in. The deaths I've been around have usually been pretty fast and often traumatic. Mostly what I remember is the screaming of the other people involved when they realize their friend or loved one is dead. That's the worst sound in the whole world, bar none. I used to work in a nursing home and a resident was passing away with his family around him. He suffered with dementia for the last 5 years and rarely spoke a coherent sentence. He looked at his grandchild and, holding his hand, said, "I love you," the grandchild name, then passed away. His grandchild had been born after the dementia set in. That one got me. It leads me to believe that despite the illness, that person is still in there. I work with dying patients all the time, but this man really struck me. I was walking through a hospital ward that wasn't my own and I was well known in the hospital as senior doctor, so the nurses knew me and asked for me to talk to the patient. I had no idea who he was or what his story was, or what I had to do. Walking toward the man, I looked down on what he had given me. It was a no resuscitation form, aka let me die. The man was barely 50 and I carefully had to explain to him the procedure and legal stuff. He looked me dead in the eye and he cried like a baby. He explained that he had no one to go home to except his dog and he was crying on what would happen to it. It felt as if the ground had been taken away from my feet. Within minutes I had a deep sense of duty towards that man who I had not known anything about. I made sure that man got to see his dog again before he passed away and I promised him the dog would be well looked after, but it just goes to show how lucky we all are to have a family. I'm an author who has written a silly book about cats. I've often sold it at various conventions. So many older people have told me that they don't know what they would do without their pet. They've lost their spouses often, friends, and family, and they just have their sweet animal to keep them company. Thank you for helping out this man. It's a lovely story. Our 25-year-old patient died of cancer. She was switched to comfort care the night before. I remember her dad running through the hall as fast as he could toward her hospital room a few minutes after she died. I don't know if he was trying to make it on time, or if he already knew she had died and was just trying to be there ASAP for his wife. I volunteered in a prison in college in a literacy program. I was tutoring a guy who killed his cousin for skimming drug profits. Apparently before the cousin died he told the guy I tutored that he understood that he had to do it. It really stuck with me how the criminal culture is different from the straight culture. AWW man, that's sad. My grandfather was in the true center of the family. 3 years ago, we were told to come say our goodbyes. My grandpa and I were very closed out, and my grandma even admitted to me a few weeks ago that I have always been their favorite grandkid. He held on as my wife, kids, and I drove the 1,800 miles almost non-stop. He hadn't apparently been lucid for almost 2 days by the time we arrived, but he hung in there just the same. As soon as I walked into the room and told him I was there, his eyes met mine and he grabbed my hand. He told me to thank everyone for coming to see him. But now I was finally there. He was happy, but tired and wanted to rest alone for a while. We all left the room, and half an hour later, he left us. I did in-home care with a woman for a year and was there when she passed. About a day before we were in the living room when we heard her yell, "Kermit, get out." That was the name of her husband who had passed a while back. The day she passed she was laying in bed and she looked straight up and exclaimed, "Look at that bright light. It's so beautiful." Then when she was getting ready to pass, her son had asked if she wanted him to leave the room. She nodded her head no. He told her he would sit there with her and hold her hand. She smiled, then took a breath and was gone. My grandma passed on at one point and was brought back. She was livid. P offered her family for making the decision to bring her back. She said dying was the easiest thing she has ever done. It felt right, and now everything was wrong. That gives me a lot of solace and peace. I've been a firefighter EMT for a few years now. In my first year my partner and I got dispatched to a fall. 2 kids fresh out of high school were out hiking and decided to climb a rock face. One of them fell and was impaled by the stump of a tree. I remember getting to where he was and his whole body was trembling uncontrollably. I went to work trying to stop the bleeding as a pool of blood had already formed around the stump while my partner called dispatch to get a heli evac. This kid looked at me and just stuttered out, "Am I going to die?" I told him I was doing everything I could and that I just need him to keep talking. He didn't say anything for 30 or seconds after that. When he finally did say something it was, "I don't want to die." This was a kid within a year or two of my age and he's depending on me and my partner to keep him alive. That was a moment where I was wondering what the heck I was doing in this profession and if this was something I could continue doing. The kid didn't make it. Heli evac wasn't available, and even if it was he would have bled out before it arrived. I ended up in counseling from that call, but I'm still here doing the same job and I love it. That's an intensely personal and scary thing your partner and that kid went through. For you to keep going after that is a testament to your strong will. Thank you for your service, man. Had an internship at a funeral home. The creepiest things evolved out of the suicide of a young guy. We didn't pick him up, but we were responsible for the burial, putting him in nice clothes, etc. We took him out of the freezing room and the morgue, and the first thing you saw was that the rope he hung himself with was still around his neck and had cut into the throat a bit. We dressed him up, and his legs up to the hips were pure purple from all the blood that got trapped in there. The other thing was the reaction of a young female relative as soon as she saw him in the coffin. She started shouting and was crying. It was the most gruesome moment in the time of my internship. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.